You are listening to CIUT 89.5 FM in Toronto, available across Canada on Star Choice National Satellite Service Channel 826, and broadcasting worldwide on www.ciut.fm.
You're listening to Point of View. I'm your host, Steve Reimer. It's December the 19th, 2003. Thank you all for tuning in here. I've got a delightful show. I've got a very special guest who, at the last minute, has agreed to come on our program. I've been focusing on a lot of social and political issues in the last couple of weeks, and one of the particular issues that really hits home for me, being as we're here at University of Toronto campus, everyone is out there working away, studying hard for their exams, and they're trying to see what they can do to excel academically, because we've been taught in our society that it's very important to get good grades, and that's the best way to, it seems, achieve a lot of success in this world, according to a lot of people. So I've invited John Taylor Gatto, who's one of the greatest sort of thinkers and speakers in this area, to give you a sense of his background. John Taylor Gatto taught in public schools in Manhattan, New York for over 30 years. Before leaving his position, he had received the New York State Teacher of the Year Award, as well as many other accolades. When he did leave, it was with a big splash, however. Actually, in fact, a piece was published in the Wall Street Journal titled, "I Quit," I think, where he made it clear that he was tired of having to, quote, hurt kids to make a living. Since then, he has been very busy speaking hundreds of times all across his country, especially, and I'm sure abroad, on the subject of educational reform. He has published several books, including Dumbing Us Down, The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling, The Exhausted School, A Different Kind of Teacher, and his latest titled The Underground History of American Education. It's with great pleasure that I invite or have John Taylor Gatto on the program today to discuss one of the biggest issues to me, which is education, and in particular public education. Thank you for coming on to the program, John. It's a pleasure to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be in Toronto, where I first fell in love many years ago.
Well, that's synchronicity for you.
She was a guide at Casa Loma, and I was a little boy, and I don't know her name, but she's probably an old lady by now, and I want her to know, whoever she is, that I was crazy about her.
Well, that's great. It's amazing we have all these great memories. Have you had a chance to do a lot of traveling in Canada over your career?
I have. I've spoken in Toronto half a dozen times, in Quebec, in Vancouver, in Saskatoon, and Edmonton, and a few other, Winnipeg, and a few other places.
Well, that's great. I have had a chance to check out your website and do a little bit of your reading. What really turned me on to your work, aside from surfing around and coming across it, was you've published a couple of articles in the last little while. One appeared in High Times magazine. I believe, was that written by you, or was it written about you?
That was written by Annie Nocenti, who was the writer for I think Spider-Man comics for years. It may still be, for all I know.
Well, that's excellent. And, of course, in Harper's Magazine, you had an article which was published or written by you.
Yes, in the September issue.
Well, that's great. And through all your work, essentially, you've laid out a thesis that basically our public education isn't what it appears to be on the outset. And
it's not at all. And our public education is the correct way, if you live in Toronto, to think of it, because U.S. and Canadian public education grew out of the same roots, and the connection between the founders of American public schools and the founders of Canadian universal command education was a very close one. Your big name is Edgerton Ryerson, and he was in constant contact with Horace Mann. Excellent. It was our big name, but neither of them, of course, were principals in the game.
Now, essentially, through all your publications, I mean, you've written extensively on the subject. What do you feel our public schools are actually teaching our children?
Well, they are teaching something that's essential for a centralized corporate economy to work well. They're teaching people to set aside the critical portion of their mentality and to follow fairly closely the injunctions of authorities, whether those are political authorities or commercial authorities through advertising. It amounts to the same thing, that our schools are a reciprocal of the kind of economy we have. And if you think about it for a moment, I'd urge your listeners not to assign that perspective to either the left or the right. It's essential. If we had small farm economies today, we would have a vastly different kind of schooling, largely because in a small farm economy, everyone needs to be skilled at many things. There aren't people to lean on. You have to be independent, self-reliant. You have to be rather parsimonious in your spending habits. You have to define yourself in different ways than by your purchases, and you have to supply largely your own entertainment, so that we would have a type of schooling in that kind of an economy which would reinforce that kind of economy. I mean, it's a sort of a common sense. So if you ask yourself, what kind of audience do you require for Big Mac hamburgers, or for cigarettes, or for packaged foods? And we could go a long, long way with this. Anybody without any prior preparation who had an open mind would be able to arrive at the kind of system that we in fact have. You said, or someone said at the beginning of your show, exams are being taken now, and we've been told that grades are the secret of our success in later life. That's a paraphrase, but I think it's fair to what I heard. Well, on March the 9th last year, on the front page of the New York Times, the Harvard University Director of Admissions said that Harvard rejects 80% of the valedictorians who apply. And when she was asked, why is that so, she said, and this is a direct quote from that paper, she said, to get into Harvard, you have to present evidence of some real distinction, and having high grades fails to qualify as real distinction. Now, if Harvard knows that, and the rest of the world should know it based on that article, among many, many others, then why on earth do we urge children to get high grades? The correlation between high grades and accomplishment in any profession cannot be established. It cannot be established. In fact, most of the CEOs of American corporations, I would imagine this would extend to Canadian, were either C-plus students or B-minus students. And if you'll recall, was it last year or the year before that George Bush boasted at Harvard that he was an example of how far a C student could get.
Bit of a mind-boggling
If grades are not evidence of real distinction according to Harvard, then why should anybody in Toronto think they are? Examine the supposition, the assumption, and it dissipates, like fog under sunlight.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You mentioned in your book, or actually in one of your articles, and it's sort of a bone of contention for a lot of people, the bell curve, and how that has influenced our schooling procedures and what have you. I'm wondering if you could perhaps elaborate on your...
Sure. The bell curve is an artifact, to use a bit of sociological jargon. It's an artifact of the way we do business. If we do business a different way, the bell curve reformulates itself and different people go to the top of it. It's not at all a permanent or even a very enduring evidence of the relationship among groups. But it's, once again, it's utterly essential to run the kind of governments and corporations that we run, even though at the top of those operations, the managers themselves don't do very well on bell curves. If bell curves, if standardized scores had any real importance, and I say this with utter confidence that no one in earshot of your program is going to escape, then any sensible person would ask their barber, their babysitter, their attorney, they would ask people, what were your standardized test scores? And most flagrant of all, they would ask their school teachers and their principals what their standardized test scores were. They would get an awful surprise. According to a book published by the New York Times in 1999, the school teacher, the superintendent, score at the very bottom of the occupational groups who take standardized tests.
And these are supposed to be the people instilling education upon our youth, of course.
But then why would any of us buy this balderdash? They don't measure what they presume to measure, what they claim to measure. They measure one thing. Standardized scores measure how you're going to do on the next standardized examination. That they measure. They don't correlate with anything else unless the correlation is rigged. If you say to enter a graduate school of architecture, you must have a certain standardized test range, and that unless you enter a school of architecture, you can't be licensed as an architect, then, mirabile dictu, you can look at the pool of practicing architects and say, well, they all had high standardized test scores, but it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's an artifact of the way we arrange things.
So you've done a lot of work in researching the history of how our modern-day educational system in North America has come to be, or in particular in the USA. Could you perhaps share some of what you've learned in terms of, I know it's a major subject, but if you could perhaps paraphrase in a couple comments.
Sure. I think I can do it quickly and I hope clearly.
Oh, great.
As long as we had a small farm, small crafts economy, there was abundant schooling around. It was not organized or layered. It was basically entrepreneurial, like being a seamstress or a traveling carnival was. It performed its function, which was a simplistic function of teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic, debating, public speaking, and argumentative writing. It did it brilliantly well. The evidence of that doesn't have to be a New York City school teacher named John Gatto. One of the great classics of North America, Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, marvels at the universal high degree of education that exists. And in de Tocqueville's words, it's much superior to that which existed in classical Greece. Even though the people are rude and ill-mannered and pushy, don't challenge them on their ability to read, write, argue in public, etc. That, of course, has vanished now, and it's vanished quite deliberately. But the vanishing isn't occasioned by evil people who want to suppress the majority. That's not the way it happens. It happens because as we evolve into a mass production economy, it becomes obvious that huge collections of capital are needed to initiate one of these businesses, and even more important than that, huge collections of capital are periodically needed to upgrade these businesses. Nobody would invest their money that way unless a return wasn't virtually guaranteed.
Mm-hmm.
Virtually guaranteed, but how do you guarantee a return when you're thinking about producing shoes 24 hours a day, thousands and thousands of pairs a day? How do you guarantee a return in a nation where little shoemakers making what we would call today custom-made shoes are everywhere? The shoes are inexpensive, and people have choices. They can use their judgment to pick a pair of shoes. What you need is a large population who can be easily influenced by images that can be connected with shoes. I don't know, pretty girls, fast cars, high life, whatever. When you have a population that can't think critically, you have the ideal customer base for mass production business, and you need that kind of customer base because you have to be able to say, if we put X number of dollars into this operation or to buy this new machinery, we can confidently expect this rate of return. You can't run this kind of an economy any other way than to be able to more or less predict what people are going to want, because you insert the wants into their minds in a whole variety of publicity techniques prior to delivering what these people think that they want. They want giant cars now, we're told, giant cars because they're safer. Now, this Sunday's New York Times had a pretty precise accounting of how much less safe the large vehicles are than the smaller vehicles. I mean, it's really quite a radical increase in danger when you buy one of those cars. Well, the idea that they're safer was planted so firmly that I know the people listening who have those vehicles say, he's just blowing smoke. That can't be true. And if you nailed them down to a bench and you showed them the statistics, forced them to memorize, they still wouldn't believe it. A book that was a bestseller in Canada just a couple years ago, and a bestseller in the States, called Fast Food Nation.
Yep.
Do you recall that book?
Absolutely. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but...
Well, in the course of reading it, you've got to read it very carefully. I mean, the book has a wonderful narrative style, and the temptation is to read it like a novel and come away with, oh, fast food, geez, it's horrible. But in fact, there are tons of details in the book that repay a close reading, one of which is, about mid-book, you learn that about 12 people a day drop dead from eating. I'll say McDonald's, but I mean the whole the whole gang. From eating fast food, 250 people a day are hospitalized from eating it. I mean, this is a number that dwarfs the loss of life in the Twin Towers.
Yeah.
Well, why does that happen? Because accountants approached, Harvard Business School people, and I'm using them as a whipping boy, as a symbol for all of them, approached these fast food companies with a new slaughtering idea about 40 years ago. They said that this huge amount of cash is necessary to use the standard slaughter procedures. But if you use kind of a bulk slaughter procedure, which is described in horrifying detail they can't even get Americans to do it, so they farm the slaughter out to South America. If you do it in this bulk process slaughter way, it's true that the contents of the intestines are driven deeply into the meat. However, if you then heat the meat to an internal temperature of blank, whatever it is, you kill all this bacteria, so that you can save a huge amount of money at the point of purchase just by heating the meat correctly. Now, that probably works as a calculus right up to the point where you hire, punk high school kids, you pay them minimum wage to heat the meat, at which point they don't care all that much that they meet the directive that's in the company manual. And so hideous viral infections and bacterial infections enter the body from just innocently consuming a Big Mac, and those lead to 12 deaths a day and 250 hospitalizations. Not a large number if you consider, the hundreds of millions of those things that are eaten every day, and yet a rather considerable number if it's you whose insides are turning into liquid, of which there's no cure. Now, that was a bestseller in this country, top of the list for 2 years. I don't know if there's been any fall off in business. I would hope there has been, and yet I don't see any McDonald's in my neighborhood closing down.
Yep, that's a good point.
You need a certain kind of mind, and the only way to produce this kind of mind reliably is to remove children from the influence of adults who love them and put these children with strangers. Not that the strangers don't feel some affection toward the children. It's simply they see the kids for 40 or 42 minutes a day, and that's it. And they see them for 1 year, and they follow orders. The word pedagogy itself describes specifically a class of slave in ancient Rome who followed the orders of the master, walked the kid to school to make sure he attended, and then did what the master said, although the master wasn't anywhere within sight. The pedagogue followed orders. Pedagogues don't think for themselves, and if there's any Canadian teacher out there, and God bless them if they do think for themselves, then I know they're in hot water in their school or their school district.
Yep, absolutely. Well, we're speaking with John Taylor Gatto here on Point of View. I'm your host, Steve Reimer. We're going to keep going right through as long as John has the time for the rest of the hour here, and we're just talking about educational reform. Now, you've had a tremendous amount of experience in the classroom and
30 years.
So to speak, in the trenches, I guess you could say.
30 years.
That's incredible. And you've also had a chance to teach at other institutions. I know you've taught at several colleges and universities in the States.
I have, and I've been traveling now for the past 12 years all over the world. I'm 100,000 miles short of 2 million miles. And when I go to Perth, Australia this October, by that time I should have 2 million miles.
Nice. You got to hit that benchmark and make that goal. That's great.
I must tell you that if you're 30, that probably sounds like a great life. But 70, not so great.
You've had enough of that airport food. It probably fits into.
I think.
Well, that's great. I was wondering if you could maybe share some of your experiences, from your time in those Manhattan schools. What were some of the things that just started to really get on your nerves, and what maybe snapped or clicked for you, I should say?
Well, I started out with degrees from 2 Ivy League colleges, Cornell and Columbia, and so I was completely sold on bell curves and scientific pedagogy, and I was only a teacher in between profitable jobs as an advertising writer, so that I didn't take the job very seriously at first because I didn't believe I would be staying. However, I did notice that there were huge contradictions between school rhetoric about caring for kids and moving them along as fast as they were able, and the actual reality where the curriculum, even for the so-called best classes, was monstrously dumbed down. How did I know that? Well, because I had grown up in a coal mining town in western Pennsylvania in the 1940s, and what we were doing routinely in a school for coal miners' kids and steel workers' kids, what we were doing routinely in, I don't know, 3rd or 4th grade was what schools on Manhattan's Gold Coast to the Upper West Side were doing in 8th and 9th grade. Nor were we protesting that our childhood was being ruined. And only a scant 20 years had passed. So I knew on the fringe of my consciousness that no situation like this could have simply evolved naturally, or if it could, it would take hundreds of years. It had to have been some deliberate project of replacing a stiff academic curriculum with a watered down one, extremely watered down in all meridians, including those in which prosperous families' kids were inducted. With that as a kind of premise, I began casually to experiment with giving individual kids or small teams of kids much more complicated work to do. Now, since I couldn't do it in the classroom, I had to bribe I know this will sound horribly racist, but the Irish custodian with 3 bottles of Paddy's Irish whiskey, which produced a master key to all the rooms in the building, plus he gave me an empty room schedule. So in spite of the rhetoric which said schools were massively overcrowded and needed lots of money to enlarge, in truth, in an overcrowded school, at any hour of the day, there's empty space, sometimes a lot of empty space. So with this key and that empty room schedule, I was able to farm out a kid or a small team of kids to work on an independent project. Eventually, I had half my classes out every day working on these projects, and the projects often had a community service component, so that often my kids would get into the newspapers for having accomplished something significant, the kind of thing that Harvard looks for when it decides whether to admit you or not. So with that experience of a couple of years under my belt, I developed a kind of hard outer shell to administrative injunctions. I mean, I never had any particular ambition to be one of these pioneers on the barricade shaking a fist, but I did have a driving need to believe that my time was being spent, in some worthwhile way. I would think that that's a universal before it's suppressed in favor of getting a paycheck or a pat on the head. So by the time the school district caught on to what I was doing. It was so well entrenched, and I had won the support of powerful institutions in the community, like Columbia University or the big hospitals, the historical museums, the Museum of Natural History there. I had support from those institutions, and what you quickly find out is that the pecking order in the school world is subordinate, to every other pecking order in society. If you have a rigid school principal in Toronto and somebody up the ladder at Consolidated Bathurst wants an exception made, there won't be any debate. How's that? I'm not being cynical. There won't be any debate. School people know, that is, well-placed school people know where they stand on the pecking order. They have lucrative incomes, they have lucrative consulting appointments, and they have an easy life, generally. That's if they don't rock the boat. So all people who believe that an improvement can be made by jettisoning the local school management and replacing it with a better superintendent. I'm not quite sure how you guys organize up there, but down here there are superintendents that float like gypsies. I mean, if a superintendent has a tenure longer than 3 years, it's quite surprising. And yet their possibility of employment stops if they have pioneered some development that runs counter to the instructions they got, regardless of how well the press greets that innovation. So I mean, I'm not the brightest bulb in the drawer, but I figured out that with outside alliances contracted first without the knowledge of the school district, because otherwise they would either forbid or pollute those alliances, with outside alliances, that I could get a kind of a blank check with my 13-year-old 8th graders on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and I believe anywhere else in the world, too. And with that blank check, I was able to run for many years a different kind of deal for 13-year-old kids that would be as close as I could make it to the deal that I was offered at the 2 Ivy League colleges I attended. And what happened over those years was the kids just blew me away over and over again. They surprised me. At the end of my 30 years, I was still being surprised when I left the business by what kids were capable of versus what we ask of them. So as soon as I got out of the business, I started what has become a full-time obsession, looking into where this institution came from, why it took the shape it took, how it's managed to persist in the face of public outrages that sprout up periodically, and retain its original shape, but ask for more money and more time out of the kid's life with which these practices will theoretically be repaired. No, they won't. Schools work brilliantly well exactly as they're constituted. They provide a product that first was intellectually conceived of and worked out in detail in Prussian Germany at the beginning of the 19th century. Rather than producing good people, good moral, ethical people, rather than producing good citizens who, after all, aren't people who obey orders. They're people who argue effectively in the public marketplace of ideas, rather than producing good people or good citizens, or even people who've developed their personal gifts to the maximum extent. What schools have been about for over a century now is providing raw material, human resources to corporate business and to corporate government. There's no clearer way to express what schools are about. Well, oddly enough, once you know what they're about, for you to individually contradict that, that direction and that mass of power is childishly simple to do. To convert a whole school or a school district or a province up in Canada to the new way of doing things is quite impossible. What you would run into is a buzzsaw of opposition, including from the craft unions, who rely on the fact that teenage kids who can master crafts very, very simply, and then, of course, deliver them at a fraction of the cost of a licensed plumber and so on, will not be allowed into the labor force. I'm not targeting unions in particular, since the CEOs of the great corporations are much more proximately the villains, but the unions have played their part in this too. This system serves certain interests extremely well, serves the Army extremely well, although your Army's not all that active, but let me tell you, ours is, as you probably know.
Yeah, I think I read a couple articles somewhere about something
Every
happening.
now and then, huh?
Well, that's great.
And that's why the Prussians developed this kind of schooling. They had suffered a tremendous defeat at the Battle of Jena in 1806 to Napoleon's forces, and they were not going to allow that to happen again. Their hypothesis was that the defeat occurred because lower-ranking officers thought for themselves and made decisions. And they wanted a habit training mechanism to make sure that people would be incapable of thinking for themselves. Even if they wanted to, they could only do it for a little while before they got a headache or they turned on a football game. I think I've described for most of my life myself, and probably everyone listening to your radio show.
Yeah. It's pretty easy to to go along with that.
I don't mean that as an insult. That's the effectiveness of 12 years of habit training out of sight of the working community. And then the cumulative effect of that, generation to generation.
Absolutely. Well, it seems clear from what you're sharing with us here and the work that you've done that our educational system has been set up really to facilitate the existing economic system that we have, which is a capitalist system. And
yeah, but you know something? In fairness, it's the only way that a systematic schooling can be set up. Could you imagine in a fishing economy, schools not being set to produce a sufficient number of crewmen and captains and mast makers and so on? It has to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way for you, for me, or for anyone listening. And if enough of us cut loose and educated ourselves and our own children, the economy would dissolve. It wouldn't dissolve overnight, but it would, bit by bit, restore itself to the kind of economy that Canada and the United States once had, which was an economy of independent livelihoods. small crafts, small entrepreneurs, small farmers. We would return to that. Would we then be able to maintain a military that dominates the planet? No, I'm afraid not. We wouldn't. Would we have better lives? Oh, my God. Does anybody think different?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I know that in your work you illustrate the differences between public education, or the education that's received in the public system, compared to the private boarding schools, which are very prevalent. And
well, I'm talking about the elite private boarding schools. I mean, there are a lot of private schools. There are really only a few of those that I'm talking about.
Okay.
And there's an inner core of about 20. And there's an outer ring that maybe raises that number to 300. And then there are other logics of schooling, like the Sudbury logic, which are certainly worth looking into. And I would say even the Waldorf logic is worth looking. And there are others, but the elite private boarding schools have refined the mechanism of producing leadership. And it's not by memorizing a lot of principles. If you look at the American election that produced George Bush went to one of these 20 inner circle boarding schools, Andover, and so did his opponent, Al Gore. I think his was St. Andrews in Washington, D.C. But more than that, of the other candidates for the American presidency in the inner circle ring, the one that came off best as a man of the people, the guy from Arizona, McCain, in fact, went to one of these 20 elite private boarding schools, one so elite that unlike Andover, almost no one's ever heard of it. It's called Episcopal High, and it's down in Virginia. And then if we go to Steve Forbes, who certainly was a familiar voice and face in the election, even though his chances of being elected were probably zero. Forbes went to Kent, a boarding school that was underwritten by J.P. Morgan. The odd thing is, with the exception of Exeter and Andover, most Americans have never heard of these places.
Yep.
John F. Kennedy went to one of them. Choate. Both Roosevelt presidents went to the greatest one of all, Groton. I mean, we're dealing here with a flim-flam game that's so grotesque and so surface that only a national mind incapable of critical thinking could see the oddity of what I'm saying to you. I mean, how many Canadian newspapers have pointed out that George Bush, who'll be the Republican candidate for presidency, is a Yale graduate, and that it's certain that one of his Democratic opponents, the one that goes up against him, will be a Yale graduate too. Why certain? Well, simply because Kerry's a Yale graduate, Dean's a Yale graduate, Lieberman's a Yale graduate. I mean, what are we talking about here? And if you go before the Bush presidency, the previous president, Bill Clinton, had a Yale degree. And if we go before him, the previous president had a Yale degree. Why, God, man, we have 3,000 colleges and universities. Could you ask a Canadian mathematician to calculate what the probability of this I'm talking about is? I mean, there is a system in place that hardly tries to conceal its existence any longer. That's what makes me very funny. I mean, it makes me laugh. It tickles my sense of humor. And none of the press, except the kook conspiracy press, ever mentions these things. You would think just as statistical oddities, this would be common knowledge.
Well, that's fascinating. What would you say we've talked in great detail about who has been going to these elite institutions, and you've talked about what separates the education that's received in one of these institutions compared to a public one.
Sure.
I'm wondering if you could perhaps elaborate on some of those key concepts.
Sure. As a topic sentence, I would say that these elite boarding institutions, and the boarding aspect is fairly important because now you have people isolated in a compound, and really unusual pressures, both direct and indirect, can be put on those people in the boarding situation. Oddly enough, my granddaughter just interviewed at Deerfield, which is one of the 20. I hope this won't put the kibosh on. And sure, the study of leadership is written in the public record for thousands of years. I mean, Plato in the Republic and the Laws is about leadership. Aristotle's Politics is about leadership. There's a continuous strain, a theme that runs through, I'll say Western civilization, but undoubtedly it runs through Eastern civilization, too, about how a leader becomes a leader, thinks like a leader, behaves like a leader. One thing that you have to eliminate from your makeup is sentimentality, isn't it? Because when it becomes necessary to assassinate somebody with a bomb, you can't really care very much about the people who are around that bomb. And I'm speaking about the United States now.
Yeah, and a particular type of leadership.
More bombs than anybody on everybody.
Absolutely.
And undoubtedly, before too much more time passes, we'll drop some bombs on Canada. I mean, we tried twice before, right? Didn't succeed, but
three times the charm.
I think we did try twice before. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I got carried away. I ran into a tree in Borneo 2 weeks ago and knocked out all my front teeth.
Oh, no.
So that accounts for the lisp you're hearing and probably for my dizzy attitude. I mean, this is most of the time I'm overwhelmed with rage when I talk about these things. Okay, the elite private boarding schools, in no particular order, stress the active literacies. I've never seen a school in Canada or the United States, a public school, that stress the active literacies. The term itself is virtually unknown to people, even though a century and a half ago it was a commonly used term in Canada and the United States. The active literacies are the key to leadership. It's not reading, it's the ability to speak effectively to any kind of group and the ability to write effectively to any kind of reader. That was at the heart of upper-class education for thousands of years. Those two things. The term itself has been eliminated in North America. You're not supposed to think of that. And if you ask a decent Canadian schoolman why the school doesn't concentrate on that to the disadvantage of every other thing the school does, it would tell you why we simply don't have enough time. Look, I have 100 kids a day. If I had, and my periods are 42 minutes long each. So if I had each kid just speak once a week for a minute, I would have eliminated the whole week's curriculum. Other than that, to which I would say, well, then do it. Please do that. Okay, so all these elite private boarding schools stress both. The secret to becoming a very, very powerful writer is simply to write 300 words a day. Most kids hearing that, and in fact most adults hearing that would say, oh my God, you can't do that. Well, 300 words is what you speak in 3 minutes.
Yes.
And you can't organize your thoughts on any subject under the sun and lay down 300 words. To reach the postgraduate level, you don't have to write books. You have to be able to organize 1,000 words at the drop of a hat. You shouldn't think, oh, what stress that is. It's just 3 lousy typewritten pages, at least the way I type, and about 3.5 the way other people type. There. Harvard, in the 1940s, required 1,000-word paper every single day in its liberal arts faculty.
Wow.
Now, here's the interesting part of it. From the post-war years through the 60s, I must have run into 100 references to the magnificent writers that Harvard had produced by its theme-a-day practice, and that clearly was the reason that Harvard overseeing these themes. However, in the early 1960s, somebody blew the whistle on the program. Here's how it worked. You wrote the 1,000 words. You dropped it into a box in front of the liberal arts building, and you never heard about it again. There were rumors among the students that these were being used to plot your future career and whether you're going to be allowed to run for office and all the rest of that. What actually was done with them is they were immediately taken out and burned. Nobody read any of them, not a single word of any of them. And then this generation of great writers was around. Well, habits lead to an awful lot of our accomplishment, good habits. And habits of good writing are one thing, and habits of obedience, habits of jumping to attention at the ringing of a bell and moving somewhere else, even though you're in the middle of some profound thought about mathematics or who knows what. Those habits, those don't wear off either for a lifetime. Once you've conditioned the population that way, obviously that's not the way they're conditioned in the elite private boarding schools. It's very, very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult for anyone to restore their integrity, to become intact and whole again after graduation, and to be a leader in their own life. We're trained to wait for teachers to tell us what to do, and when you're 60, you still are waiting for someone to tell you what to do.
That's pretty true. We've only got a couple minutes left here, and I was wondering if you could perhaps share some tidbits of information with our listeners as to what recommendations you would make to our existing education system.
Sure.
I know I'm not leaving you a lot of time
I will
there.
do that. But you must promise in front of all your thousands of witnesses to send me an air check of this program.
Oh, of course.
And to let me mention where people could get my books if they want them.
Oh, I would love you to do that. That'd be great.
Okay. If you go to my website, www.johntaylorgatto.com, Taylor is spelled Taylor, and Gatto is Gatto. There will be a former student of mine who's taking the money that you'll pay for the books and using it to make a movie called The Fourth Purpose.
You could do a whole show on that.
I think that systematically it's idle to talk about what should be done because it won't be done. I'm not being cynical. The schools perform a vital function in a capitalist economy now, and they're hardly going to, out of shame, say, well, okay, we'll do it away to produce maximum power in everybody. I mean, it's not going to happen. However, what people should do, either students, that would be best, or parents, or guardians, or little bands of community people, is to first determine I think the easiest thing to do would be to determine what the top 20 elite private boarding schools actually do, and then to inform the kids that it isn't likely they're going to get these things in school. They're not to make trouble for the school, but they're to stand back in their classroom time like anthropologists and study how other people are massified there. And then with their spare time, fortunately we know that it only takes about 2 hours a day to get a magnificent, a superb education. In fact, the homework I assign your listeners is to pick up a copy of a book that's been continuously in print for, it must be 200 years or 250 years. It's the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. It's only 100 pages long, and you'll learn from that book that Franklin was working a 60-hour week, hard work, and in his spare time at the age of 12, he was putting himself through a curriculum, and several of his friends too, that I tell you Harvard wouldn't dream of asking its undergraduates to go through today.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much for coming on our program here. For all of our listeners, you're listening to Point of View. I'm your host, Steve Reimer. We've had John Taylor Gatto, an educational reformer, and a really passionate individual who's managed to take some time out of his busy speaking schedule to come on our program here and share his thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. God bless Toronto. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Starting in my heart, reaching a fever pitch, and it's bringing me out the dark. Finally, I can see you crystal clear. Go ahead and sell me out, and I'll lay your shit bare. See how I'll leave with every piece of you. Don't underestimate the things that I will do. There's a fire starting in my heart, reaching a fever pitch, and it's bringing me out the dark. The scars of your love remind me of us. They keep